Okay, looks like we've got a fair few people in here already. My name's Corinne Whelan. I'm one of the senior lawyers in the franchising team at LegalVision, and I know you've registered to hear from me about how to franchise your business. I've got Jacquie here.
Hi everyone.
I'll let her introduce herself.
Yeah, I'm Jacquie. I head up our growth team here at LegalVision, and I work really closely with our franchisor clients, sort of from them first coming to LegalVision through their journey with us. So yeah, thank you so much for coming and spending some time with us this morning. Hopefully we can make it punchy but powerful. We've got 30 minutes where I'll be asking Corinne questions, mainly questions that we've both been asked, hundreds of times from clients over the years. And then also opening up 15 minutes at the end for you to ask any questions that we'll try to get through. So if you do have something that comes up as Corinne is speaking, feel free to drop it in the chat box and we will come back to those and address them at the end. So you may as well jump straight in, but thanks again for joining. Corinne, I think a good place to start is just to be clear on what is a franchise.
Yeah, so a franchise is essentially a franchisor, so that would be you in these circumstances, who will be providing or growing their business by essentially creating multiple units of a business that you've already created. The way you grow that is by licensing all of the goodwill, intellectual property, and all of the reputations, the way you know how to run that business, to individual franchisees, which are other business owners. So you can expand your network, you can have multiple business units, but by having other people involved in the business and helping run the day-to-day side of the business. By essentially, licensing the IP.
Great. And franchising obviously isn't the only way a business owner can grow their business. What are the benefits? Why would someone consider franchising as an option that might work well for them?
Yeah, so obviously franchising isn't the only way, but franchising is fantastic because it allows you to expand your business but still have control over how your brand is sold and represented out in these networks. There are so many other benefits. It gives employees, for example, if you want to have them as your franchisees, it gives them a say in the business. It gives them a bit of an ownership right. They take ownership over that business. They grow that business themselves, and you get to spend time in the background helping to grow your brand and reputation as a whole without needing to run the day-to-day aspects of each individual store that you might find that you would have if you were growing through a normal corporate structure, for example. There's a lot of things that make it really, really good as well. Like, you can continue to protect it. So you can make sure that people are doing what you want them to do rather than kind of going rogue, which is one of the problems you see in licensing quite often because it can be a bit too hands off. So you're giving them a little bit of a right, whereas franchising, you have more control. It's also more cost effective, generally speaking, because it means that you are able to grow the business without having all of your own money invested in it. It allows franchisees to invest in it and pay you a recurring fee, but also to grow the business on their own and to derive a benefit and a revenue from that. So it's essentially two people winning from the relationship.
Yeah, that's what we hear a lot, is that it's less capital intensive. If you're in an industry that requires a lot of upfront costs, whether it's machinery, expensive fit outs, franchising is a way that you don't have to foot the bill of those costs, but you can still benefit from the increased footprint of your brand in Australia or overseas, and doing it more quickly than if you were having to rely on cash flowing it or getting lending and funding.
Exactly.
I know another thing we hear as well is that if you need to have a local presence, it's hard to manage a team remotely. By having a franchisee who has a network, this existing network can be really valuable.
Exactly.
So if I was, thinking about franchising and thinking that obviously, as most of you must be, where should I start? What do I need to do first?
Yeah, so the first things I would say to think about are, how do you want to structure your model? Do you want to have particular control over a corporate structure or not? How do you want to see it flow through? What kind of fees do you want to charge? What kind of territories do you want to allocate, or do you want them to have territories? There are all kinds of aspects to franchising that should be thought about, and you should probably get assistance from a lawyer as you do it. It's really important to understand whether you want to provide a franchisee with exclusivity, for example. And there's ways you can start planning that out from the beginning through talking to a lawyer, and experts in the industry to start flowing that out and working out, okay, I want a franchise, but what practically does that look like? And how do I keep expanding and do it in the right way to make sure it complies with the legal obligations as well?
Yeah. So what do you think is the number one thing that a business owner should be doing? If there was one thing they had to do to get themselves ready, what's the top thing?
Definitely get the legal documents right.
Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, I would highly recommend get a franchise agreement, get your disclosure document, and talk to a lawyer about what those two documents look like and what the requirements are. Obviously, franchising is regulated in Australia, which is something that a lot of people don't know when they first come to me. So the way we draft franchise agreements and your disclosure document, which is another required document you have to have in Australia, depends on so many things that are specific to your business. So don't go it alone. Make sure you have help and someone there that legally knows what to do and how to draft those documents and can help you provide this opportunity and grow your business in a way that's tailored towards your individual business needs.
Yeah.
So yeah. Definitely documentation.
What are things that people forget or maybe get wrong in the early days of franchising?
Yeah, so I would say kind of similar to what's important and what we've just discussed. Some things that often do go wrong are franchisees being onboarded that maybe shouldn't have been onboarded, which is again another reason why we would say it's important to get legal advice and to make sure your documents are set up right and to help, you know, in the process of granting those franchisees and those franchise agreements. So quite frequently, you know, there will be times when a franchisee will be onboarded and maybe they weren't right for your business. And that's okay because every network goes through it. It's just important to know that that is something that can go wrong. The other thing that I would say to contemplate is obviously in a similar vein, what your legal obligations are and to know what they are, because often it does happen where franchisors may not fully be aware of what their obligations are, and that's when things can get a little bit sour, or when it, you know, might come up when you've got a franchisee in the network who's maybe flagging some issues with you, and that's when you realize, oh man, like we didn't do this right, we weren't compliant here. So those things can be easily avoided if you do have someone there to help you along the way, and it's done kind of in the proper process with the lawyer involved.
Yeah, I think that recruitment part of it, sort of who do you bring into the franchise is just so important, isn't it? And ensuring in that process that you're not overselling the dream.
Yeah.
That's where we also see things go wrong, that kind of realistic expectation setting. Of course, on the one hand, you want to get people really excited about the prospect of joining your business, of becoming great advocates for your brand and helping you to grow the business.
Yeah.
But if you are off telling them you'll be doing $1 million in month 2 and the margins are incredible, you know, you can't beat them anywhere else, there's a real risk that it's going to come back to bite you. And also you're just not allowed to do it, really.
Yeah, exactly.
So understanding what you can and can't do in conversations with franchisees.
Yeah.
Important, so you're not creating issues for yourself down the line.
Yeah.
Usually where it sours is misalignment of what's going to happen.
Yeah, misalignment of the relationship. Usually from the beginning, kind of representations that may or may not have been made, or misunderstandings between both the franchisee and the franchisor can quite frequently come up. One other thing that I've actually just thought of that I should mention, where things can go wrong is in relation to your intellectual property and protection of the intellectual property. So quite frequently with franchising, franchisees who come into the network often think that because they own the business, they own all the intellectual property derived from the business. Obviously, that's not the case because you're the franchisor. You've built a brand, you've built a reputation, and that's something important to consider as well, to make sure that those rights are understood at the beginning and those obligations are understood at the beginning, to ensure that there's no misunderstanding with the franchisees about who owns what during the franchising process.
Yeah, I think, and what can we do practically as business owners to make sure we're protecting our brand as much as possible?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's so important. Franchising is essentially you trusting someone else. It's sometimes, in most cases, a stranger or an employee with all of the confidential information of your business, how it's profitable, and, you know, essentially giving them all the right to use your trademarks and the things that make your brand unique. So The best ways I would recommend protecting it is by having deeds of confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements. And they're usually provided to a franchisee prior to having them sign up and into the franchise network. That way, if you're sharing some information through the normal franchise agreement and things like that, you can protect it. Another way, obviously, is through your documentation that's given to a franchisee when they sign up. So their franchise agreement, in there's normally guarantees, which is complicated, but essentially help protect you where someone's entering into something as a corporation. And moreover, another thing I would recommend is your corporate structure. So we generally recommend that you separate out your entities in a way that helps protect the assets in those entities. That way you don't have, someone can't make a claim against you in relation to intellectual property, and you can protect those assets while you've got, maybe potential other companies that hold other assets or potential other liabilities. So all of those things are ways we could help you, and a way a lawyer should sit down with you to help you understand, okay, what is your specific need for your business? What kind of intellectual property are we dealing with? Do we need to register some trademarks? Do we need to work through all of these things? How should we essentially draft or create your business structure in a way that protects all of your assets and helps you onboard all your franchisees?
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I think trademarking, and a lot of the clients we speak to haven't yet trademarked, which is okay. We can do it at the point of setting up your franchise, but it's almost just a kind of non-negotiable. We must do that to make sure we've covered you.
Yeah.
And another thing, you mentioned NDA. I think it's that can be really helpful, kind of, but also making sure that you're not oversharing to early prospect franchisees.
Yes.
There are things that you want to, you can have open conversations about, but if you have some really business critical confidential information, it might be a recipe, it might be a way of doing things, it might be a supplier list, it might be a way that you price your product, whatever that is that's unique to you, maybe keep that close to your chest until you're more progressed in conversations or you've actually onboarded them as a franchisee of your business.
Certainly, yeah.
Something I hear all the time from potential franchisors, and where I think people get quite confused and maybe overwhelmed, is how do I price this thing? You're really confident in how you make money off your own business, but now that you're franchising it, how do I actually, what are the fees I should be charging to franchisees to make sure, everyone's winning? What should they do?
So there are several fees that we would normally recommend you charge, but also the fees you charge will vary depending on the type of business you're running and how hands-on you want to be in the franchise. An example of a fee that you may or may not want to include is a marketing fee or a marketing fund, which is you undertaking marketing on behalf of the entire franchise network. Some franchisors decide to do that, some don't, and that's why it needs to be individualized and tailored. The most common fees that you would charge would be an initial franchise fee that you charge as a one-off payment for initially providing all of the relevant documents and all of the, goodwill and IP for the brand. On top of that, you would have a recurring fee, and normally the recurring fee is, and it can be any number, it could be a set figure, it could be a percentage of revenue, and that kind of is an ongoing fee that's paid almost as a royalty for continually using the brand and the reputation. And depending on the fees you charge, it's really important to make sure that those fees are charged in a way that will both provide you with enough money to continue to run your business and operate your business as the franchisor, to update and provide resources and make sure that you are able to help out the franchisees in your network. But it also needs to be a fee that makes it reasonable and makes it a financially reasonable business for the franchisees. If your fees are too high, then franchisees will be deterred and they will probably not want to be, entering into an agreement where it looks like they're not going to make a huge profit. So it's important to balance the fees about what you're getting and what you want to give the franchisee in order to make it profitable for them. In almost all circumstances, the success of the franchisee becomes the success of the franchisor, and that's really, really important to keep in mind when you're rolling out franchising. Royalty fee as an ongoing fee, initial franchise fee. Usually we have documentation fees, and that covers you for the legal fees in us preparing any relevant grants, which is when we sign up a franchisee for you, or when you find a franchisee and we prepare the documents for them, marketing fees, and then there's all kinds of ongoing fees, administrative fees. Some franchisors are more hands-on and help with some payroll obligations or help with, day-to-day admin of the business. And depending on that, we can I can talk all day about the types of fees, but it's also important to consider that that is also a very commercial element that should be understood from your own perspective and your own knowledge of the business. But also, if you ever have questions and you aren't sure what your fees should be and what is profitable in the industry, there are particular consultants and people out there that do help find out and give you that information in order to grow or develop the business in the way that works for you.
Yeah, and if not already, doing some mystery shopping around competitors and what they charge can give you a good baseline. And a lot of times we have to comfort our franchisors to let them know you don't have to lock into these fees forever. You might start with something that you think is a little bit more generous for new franchisees and increase it with time. As you mentioned, Corinne, the early franchisees really become proof of concept. They're going to be the sort of shining beacons of what it is to be a successful franchisee in your business. So starting with something that makes sure they can win is going to mean maybe delaying the profitability that you could have, but possibly build in a really long-term successful franchise network that I think is what you're all kind of wanting to do. We've talked, obviously when we think franchising, we always think about the legal elements of franchising because that's what we live and breathe. What are the key legal documents or legal things that a franchisor needs to have or do?
Yeah, so the first two main documents that you are required to have are the franchise agreement and a disclosure document. Franchise agreement sets out all of the commercial elements of the arrangement and essentially dictates the relationship between you and the franchisee. Now, a disclosure document is a particular document that is prescribed by the Franchising Code of Conduct, which is the relevant legislation that dictates franchising in Australia. That document is provided in a specific format. It isn't necessarily, you can't just kind of add things to it, which is again why I would recommend you talk to a lawyer and you get a lawyer's assistance in having these documents drafted, because that is a very specific document that needs to be drafted in a very legal way. And as is the franchise agreement, I've seen some agreements that have been, 13 pages long. And if you have a franchise agreement that's 13 pages long, it's very unlikely that that is going to meet all of your legal needs and protect you adequately as the way you would want to as you franchise and grow your business. So would highly recommend making sure your franchise agreement and your disclosure document are in place. And then any ancillary documents depend on the structure and the model of your business and I guess how hands-on you want to be. But as I spoke about earlier, an NDA, so a non-disclosure agreement of some kind that you would normally provide prior, and a license agreement or a step-in deed where you are dealing with a lease. So obviously if you're taking on the lease for a franchisee or if the franchisee is taking on a lease in your place, there are different documents that are required and we would help you and be able to assist you in getting all of that done. So they're the kind of other ancillary documents we would normally draft and that we would recommend as kind of like the crucial ones to consider.
Yeah, awesome. So if I've gotten those documents set up, you've spoken with a legal team, they've drafted them based on your instructions and your plan for business. Then I've gone out and I've found, maybe I've already got someone interested in franchising my business. I found someone who I'm wanting to bring into the network, wanting to onboard them. What do I do then? What actually happens?
Yeah, so once you've found someone to onboard into the network, we would provide you or draft a niche agreement for that particular franchisee. So they need to have documentation that sets out what the requirements are and what the expectations are of them in the franchise network. So that's where we would draft a personalized franchise agreement for them, insert all of their details. They also need to receive at the time of being granted or provided with the franchise agreement a copy of that disclosure document that I just spoke about. So you would need to be providing the franchisee with a franchise agreement and a disclosure document, any of the ancillaries that we've discussed, and you would need to be giving that to them. Now, a franchisee actually has to have those documents for 14 days before they can execute them, which is something, again, most franchisors or most people looking to franchise don't know, which obviously in business, 14 days can be quite a long time and can protract things, but it's important to ensure that you do comply with that because it's dictated by the code. So it can be a bit of a waiting game, but it is important. So there is kind of those initial steps that I would recommend. Training the franchisee as well once they're onboarded. You need to think about what that looks like practically, particularly if you're based in one state and they're looking at another state. What does all that look like practically? How do you onboard them? What kind of procedures do you have in place for getting them built up as an individual and becoming part of your business?
Yeah, and usually that would be all covered in an operations manual, wouldn't it? Or some kind of playbook that, could be as specific as, how to, with McDonald's, how many pulls of the salt shaker for, the amount of fries. It can be really prescriptive to make sure the quality of service and product is consistent, which ties back to retaining the kind of integrity of the brand, which is so important if you've built that up and worked really hard on that.
Yeah.
And also helps give them more value. It's showing them how to do things and do it properly.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about the sort of legislation and needing to comply, and that there are sort of grave consequences if we fail to do so. It's with the 14 days, it can be that the franchisee can get out of the franchise, right? If we don't do that. So pretty significant consequences. So maybe just touch on that. What is the franchising legislation and that we need to be aware of?
Yeah, so the Franchising Code of Conduct is part of the Australian consumer law in Australia. And what it does is it dictates predominantly the obligations on franchisors as they franchise in Australia. It does prescribe some obligations and rights in relation to franchisees. And the idea of it is, unfortunately, it came about as a result of a lot of people franchising and doing the wrong thing. So it was one of those circumstances where a few people ruined it for the lot. But the idea of the code is to help assist franchisees and to protect franchisees. So what that means for you as a franchisor or as someone looking to franchise is that you should be familiar with the code because it has a bunch of obligations and a lot of things that you should be on top of. For example, the disclosure document that I spoke about earlier, that actually has to be updated yearly. And so there's an ongoing compliance kind of check that you should be doing. You should be regularly touching base, making sure you are complying with the relevant obligations of the code. The code prescribes a type of procedure for disputes, for example. So there's compulsory mediation, which is something a lot of people don't know or understand. And it's a preventative measure to stop essentially franchisees and franchisors suing each other straight away. Tries to resolve disputes as an alternative resolution rather than going through the expensive court process that is, and also taking way longer as well. So the code is very prescriptive in what you are required to do, what your expectations are. There are potential and kind of some financial obligations that are outlined in it in relation to your disclosure document. So there is a lot there to consider and a lot there that dictates what you should and shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, and I feel like the code, it can be a little bit scary to potential franchisors. It can feel like it's, this almighty, impossible to comply with, legislation that's changing all the time and just making things harder to run a successful franchise business. But I think we sort of see it as being prescriptive, but there is absolutely a way to operate well within the confines of the code. And you should be aware of your obligations, but ultimately it's for your legal team to really know exactly what you can and can't do, to let you know when things have changed, when you need to do something differently. So yeah, I'd say don't let that be the thing that sort of scares you away. It's just something to be kind of to accept and be aware of as part of the kind of kit and caboodle of franchising. So I've worked really hard to find what I think to be a great potential franchisee. I know I've heard from you that recruitment's really important. I've tried to really find someone that fits my values, that I think is going to be someone I want to work with the next 5 to 10 years, because that's how long we're going to be in business together for, right? But sadly, things go wrong. They weren't the right fit. The expectations haven't aligned. It's not working. They're not doing the right thing, for whatever reason it's not working. What can I do then if things go wrong?
Yeah, so when things go wrong, most franchise agreements have an obligation in there about breaching a franchisee. So the idea of breaching a franchisee is you find the relevant part of the franchise agreement they aren't complying with, and you would send them a notice of breach that says, hey, this is where you're going wrong, this is where we require you to fix it, and you give them a reasonable period of time to fix that problem that they have. Quite often, the franchisee will fix it and will send you an acknowledgement saying, yep, sorry, we won't do it again.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are the kind of what happens after that can be varied. If the franchisee doesn't want to or doesn't like what you've told them, they can issue you with what we call a notice of dispute, which is something, again, that the code allows them to do. And that would put you on notice that the franchisee doesn't agree with that, the breach that you've issued. But then again, then there's kind of procedures derived by the code that explain how you will practically go about that. So you will be going through mediation, but like I said before, much more cost effective than going to court.
Yeah.
So that is one thing that you can often do. If they don't issue you with a notice of dispute and you don't hear back from them and they don't remedy the breach, the terms of the franchise agreement should provide you with a right to terminate that franchisee and manage them out of the network. Obviously, you need that right because you can't have someone out there with your brand not adequately representing your brand, and in some cases, damaging that reputation in a way that can be quite bad. So it's very important to consider what are the terms in our franchise agreement that allow us and afford us rights to either have a breach remedied or to have someone removed from the network when they aren't adequately performing.
Yeah. So there's a staged process that we would step through, and that's sort of set out in the franchise agreement and the code. And yeah, I think you're exactly right that being, having a strong agreement, having a good recruitment process is part of it, but ongoing kind of auditing or maintenance of your network to make sure people are doing the right thing is equally important, especially in the sort of, internet era where a disgruntled customer of a franchisee of yours can blast whatever they want all over the internet, which could have a pretty massive impact on the rest of your network and ultimately the value of your franchise to your franchisees potentially.
Yes.
So all of that is really important.
Yeah.
I'm obviously thinking that things are going to go well if I'm setting up my franchise. I might want to have 10 franchisees. I might have a vision of 250 franchisees or more. What can I be doing now when I'm setting up my franchise to future-proof it?
Yeah, so I've touched on this a little bit earlier, but certainly working out how you want your territories to look is very important, or whether you will have territories and whether those territories or marketing areas are going to be exclusive. One thing, if you're only looking at granting, say, a franchise per state, then that's fine. But if you want to grow your franchise network and earlier on in the piece you've committed to a whole state for one franchisee, your ability to grow your franchise is going to be severely limited by the first franchise you granted in order to get someone across the line. So think about it from the beginning. I would say try and avoid just winging it along the way. It would be really good for you to think about how practically is this going to work? What kind of territories are we going to establish? Are those territories financially viable for that area? Sometimes and quite often we recommend people go to people who help establish territories or look at the, whether there's going to be value derived from a particular area. And, there's all kinds of parameters in which you can view that. And depending on the type of business you have, those parameters are so different. So definitely think about your business and what it looks like from an expansion model perspective. Where do you want stores? Where don't you want stores? How will that look? So
as sort of lame as it is, starting with the end in mind a little bit, not having to have all the answers, but having a bit of a vision for where you want to go, so you don't. Franchisors come to us, and some things we can't undo once they're at a certain stage. I can't just take that franchise off someone and say, sorry, you've got 3 neighbours now that are also franchisees. That's important to get right.
Yeah, so I would definitely say future-proofing it through understanding how you're going to expand and what it will look like you said, towards the end. Also, it goes without saying, ensuring your legal documentation is good from the beginning. Because if you enter into an agreement tomorrow for a 5-year term, you're essentially locked into that agreement for 5 years. So, and 5 years is actually quite a long time in the business world. So, and sometimes there's an option for 10. So you want to be thinking about what's my business going to look like now and what's it going to look like in 5 years and 10 years time. So definitely be thinking and making sure that your documentation is right and adequate in order to do that.
Yeah, awesome. Great, well, why don't we move to some questions now? Thank you for anyone who sent some through. Okay, the first one, what is an estimated cost to get franchise documents drafted? Just a great question.
Yeah.
And if you ask different lawyers, you might get drastically different answers. Yeah, do you want to speak to that, Corinne?
Yeah, so if we're talking about actually doing the initial draft, so us drafting a franchise agreement, disclosure document, and everything up front, depending on the size of your business, LegalVision has different models and I guess, different kind of ways we charge through a subscription model. Other law firms charge, from what I understand, like quite in the upper end of things. Sometimes you're looking at over $20,000 just for the initial documentation. We try and keep
50, I've heard over 100.
Sometimes 50,
yeah.
sometimes over 100. So we have tried to bring those costs down through our services that we provide, because we want to have an ongoing and long-term relationship with you. We don't want to kind of burn you at the beginning and then leave you high and dry. So the idea is, let's create a fee structure that works for ongoing reviews and ongoing legal work and sign-up work. And then generally, just touching on what are the costs to get after they're drafted, is when you're onboarding franchisees, generally you would pay a documentation fee, and the franchisee would reimburse you for that. And that's generally anywhere between $2,000 to $3,000 plus GST. Yeah.
Yeah, which under our franchise or membership we cover.
Yeah.
So if you have one franchisee you bring on or 10 in year one, that's all covered under the fee in our franchise. I mean, we can talk about this with anyone who's interested, but our membership starts at $4.99 a week for a sort of minimum 12 months. And that covers kind of everything we've touched on today around brand protection. If you do need a new company set up, obviously getting the core documents drafted, and that can be a nice way to balance out the fees over a period of time, and also have the comfort and support of a legal team in your corner throughout that, those early years of franchising, which, can often be the really important ones.
Yeah, they often definitely are.
Awesome. Do I need an accountant for franchise expansion, or is it mainly legal?
That's a really good question. Yes, it's mainly legal, but I would recommend you talk to your accountant about expanding as well, and talk to them about what everything is, from your own financial perspective. The other thing that you will need is when we're drafting your disclosure document, you are required to provide some financial reports and have an audit report done by an accountant. So you should have an accountant involved in the process, and you should be regularly communicating with your accountant so that they're aware of where you're going. I often recommend that if you are looking at franchising, or if you are a franchisor, talk to or find an accountant that understands the industry. That's really important. Quite often I say, hey, we need these reports, which you actually have to have done yearly as well. So when I say, hey, can we get these financial reports or this financial statement done, often my clients will look at me and go, oh, well, I don't know what that is. So I need to, then tell their accountant what that is and what that looks like. So if you find an accountant that is good at franchising, I would highly recommend.
Yeah, we have some recommendations that we can give as well. I think starting with your current accountant, can they do it? If not, we can give you a referral to some franchise specific ones. Can you give some examples of reasonable franchising or licensing fee charges? Everyone's favorite question. It's really hard, isn't it? It's so variable based on industry and business, but what are some examples?
Yeah, so that is very, very subjective, because it depends so much on the type of industry you're in, and honestly, the way you're, what's financially viable for you as well, like how much input you have, what kind of equipment you provide initially. So often, if you're providing a bunch of equipment, then your licensing fee or your franchising fee might be low, might be higher, because you're providing a bunch of things as well.
I guess to give a range of, a small coffee cart franchise that might have a $10,000 franchise fee and an ongoing royalty, what we usually see is 5 to 15%.
Yeah, anything from 5 to 15%
is kind of reasonable, but I've seen higher. Again, the higher you charge, the more you've got to be really confident you're providing that ongoing value.
Yeah.
And the franchising fee could be, you know, in the millions for a McDonald's style franchise. So there's really such a range. Yeah, it's the kind of thing where it's doing some industry research. We can talk to you about your specific business and give you a better idea once we know sort of what you do in your industry. But you know, there's lots of franchises that are in the 50 to 200K range. You know, that's kind of a common bracket. But really, it's up to you. And it's also what your customer, ultimately your franchisee, is willing to pay, right? So if you're having early conversations with people interested in your business and your brand, and they're saying, oh yeah, look, I'd be so great, I'd be willing to spend $250,000 on getting into this franchise, that's a good test of what your potential franchisee might be willing to pay.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's important. And just kind of recapping the fee, you know, we've just said it could be 10,000, it could be hundreds of thousands. So that gives you an idea of how broad it can be and how subjective it is depending on the type of business you have. Definitely we can, you know, take it offline and have a conversation with you about what you would like to see and what is normal for your industry.
How much will it cost to upgrade an existing franchise agreement? So I imagine this might be someone who's already a franchisor or just thinking ahead to when they need upgrades done.
Yeah, so that will depend again usually on the size of your network and how extensive the changes are. I feel like Jackie can probably speak a bit to our fees for this.
I think you're right, but it depends on the changes. It might be, you know, what we see a lot of times when franchisors need to update their agreements, it's forced on them by legislation changes, and we have that coming up this year in July. There's a likely change going to come in which will impact franchisors, meaning changes to their agreements. We've tried to account for this in the membership. I know I keep going on about it, but the membership will include any changes that you need to the agreement. So for the sort of life of the membership, any changes you need, whether it's because your business has changed and the way that you work with franchisees is now different, or because you're forced to make changes based on legislation, we do that for you. If we were doing it as just a one-off project, you know, it could be as little as $1,000, $4,000, could be more if it's a more drastic update that's, you know, a redraft or really significantly changing it. But that gives you a bit of an idea.
Yeah, and if you wanted us to sit down, we could actually have a look and say, okay, this is what we recommend. Say, you know, do a bit of an audit. We can do a document, which is something that we definitely do for clients as well.
If I'm unsure whether or not a franchise is something I want to do or is best for my circumstances, who's the best person to speak with, a lawyer or someone who's already involved in a franchise?
That
great question.
Is a really good question. So two things. I agree with both. Like, you should talk to a lawyer because we can definitely help you decide if that's right for you. We can work out, you know, how much control do you want to have? If you don't want to have that much control, then maybe licensing it is it. But if you do want to have control and you really want to protect your goodwill and your intellectual property, then franchising is probably the way. So definitely talk to a lawyer. But if you are curious, and I've done this for previous clients of mine where they're interested in franchising, but they're not quite sure and they want to talk to someone in the industry that knows, I've actually had someone sit down with them that was a previous client, that was a franchisor, that had grown their network to a really large network across Australia. And they sat with them and they said, what do we need to do? Do you recommend it? What were the troubles? And spoke to someone in the industry about it. So really, really recommend doing that. If you don't know anyone, there's potential that we can put you in touch with someone that we know that you could talk to. But yeah, definitely.
And it would be interesting hearing from a franchisor and even a franchisee perspective as well. If someone has said, oh yeah, look, I like being a franchise of insert franchise here, maybe in the industry you're in, but I find this challenging, or I felt I don't get enough support from my franchisor when it comes to marketing. I'm the one who's having to put together specials and offers. I really wish I had that from my franchisor, or whatever it is, or, you know, they're constantly changing the suppliers, so I can't keep up. That's all super useful to know what not to do. And it's because it's not all, you know, daisies and, you know, there can be things that go wrong. You should understand that. And we can obviously, because we see the full spectrum, we do see when things go wrong. We can speak to that as well. But I think it's nothing better than coming from the mouth of someone who's done it. Average timeline, we'll do speed round for the next few questions. We've got 5 minutes left. Average timeline to set up a new franchise, how long does it take to get up and running?
Yeah, so we usually are able to do it within a couple of weeks to a month, but I would say from rolling out the franchise it will obviously take longer for you, just because once we've got the actual documentation, usually we find the onboarding process will vary between over a few months. From our initial discussion with you and initially kind of having a conversation, how quickly it happens will depend on, you know, how many revisions we need to make, whether you know, what kind of thoughts you might have. We might give you some advice. You might decide, I don't want to do that anymore. So it can be subject to change, but I'd say on average, generally about a couple of weeks to a month, depending on the size of the network, how much work's involved.
So from the legal perspective, within a month. And then for how long it actually takes to get your first franchisee in situ ready to go, it kind of depends on the interests of franchisees that you have and how prepared you are with everything surrounding legal. So for example, having the operations manual ready to go, and that will see is done alongside. So if you give yourself that kind of month to get those other things ready, to be having conversations with potential franchisees, we've had franchisors from conversation up and running, franchisee ready to go within a month. Like it really can be, kind of fast tracked depending on how keen you are to get it going.
I should say that we work quickly than most firms. Most other firms where I've worked at before, it usually takes a few months. So
we get moving. With someone asking about procedures, what level of help can we give outside the law? We try to be really commercial and give guidance that we see from, you know, our experience in the industry and working with partners that specialize in other areas. But things that are better served with other help, we'll give you referrals and that you can consider for those things. So I think it's a mix of, we know our strengths and we kind of stay in our lane, but we'll try to give you some guidance as well on other kind of general. Do we pay membership to get the franchise documents? So the membership, our membership fee covers the franchise document setup fee, which is the bulk, the sort of the most expensive part, if you like, of setting up a franchise.
And in addition to that, the ongoing franchisee work as well as you sign them up, which is important.
From our experience, what are the things that have gone wrong and how are they solved with your support? Great.
That's a really good question. I can think of an example that I solved just the other day, actually, which was a franchisee that was doing the wrong thing, as you would expect. They were buying product from a non-approved supplier. I gave some advice to our client about whether they wanted to breach that franchisee and put them on notice that, you know, they needed to stop. And I think at that point, the franchisor had told the franchisee about 3 times without issuing a formal breach notice, not to do it. And it was really, really good to see and very, very interesting to see that the second we got involved and sent out a formal breach notice, the franchisee actually sent back a really lovely reply saying, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize I was like doing this ongoing. I'm apologize, and we fixed it straight away. And it was just one of those scenarios where it was something that could have become so much of a bigger problem, but it was so easily and so quickly resolved. And often, like, another example is, you know, with disclosure obligations, quite often franchisees, and it's so fair, the legislation is quite convoluted and hard to understand, and quite often franchisees don't understand it and what their rights or obligations are. And often they'll be, you know, they'll kind of raise a bit of an issue with the franchisor. And when we step in and we say to the franchisor, hey, this is what we've done, how we've advised you, this is why what we're doing is right, we can prepare a response for the franchisee. And more often than not, the franchisee will go, okay, I get it now. I understand what you were saying. I've misunderstood, which is quite often the case.
And it's that balance, isn't it, of not going in too heavy-handed. This is an ongoing relationship. And unless this is the point of termination, let's try to approach this in a way that means we can keep the sort of, as much as possible, a good working relationship here, and assume good intent from the franchisee before we really, you know, establish there's no way to come back. Okay, well, thank you so much for all of your questions, everyone. Hopefully this was useful. I mean, these are questions we're asked all the time and things that we're constantly thinking about to help clients understand at that kind of crucial launch or early phases of franchising, you know, the things that we think you should know. One thing that we'll do after this is send everyone a soft copy of our franchisor toolkit. It really goes into a bit more detail on all of the different areas that we've touched on today, and hopefully you'll find that useful. We will also send through a recording of this session for if you missed parts of it or you know, want to rewatch. But if you do, and also an option to sort of complete a survey to give us some feedback, but also book in for a strategy session with us if you'd like. So that would be sort of a one-on-one with you, talking more specifically about your business and your goals, and for us to give you some, you know, no cost guidance on what we recommend you do, or things that you should be thinking out for where you are at your stage of business and your franchising plans.
Yeah.
So do take us up on that, and we, you know, hopefully can add some value. And obviously, if you do need legal support and you don't have a legal partner that you work with at the moment, we would love to support you. And the franchising membership is something that's quite new for us. It's kind of been born from demand from our franchisor clients. So hopefully, you know, it's something that could be of interest to you, and is a way that we can support you on an ongoing basis. So thank you again for the time, and we've had a lot of people sticking around, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah, either book in a meeting with us or just flip them through, and you're really happy to answer them.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.